All right. Can anyone hear me on the computer?
Yeah, you're good.
We got a thumbs up. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. We've got our April WPA forum. Thanks for coming in person. It's great to see a lot of people here. We've got a couple awesome speakers today. So Dave Demmer and Mike Berdash will be presenting. They can introduce themselves, but just a couple quick WPA updates. Yeah, April's already here, so field season's kicking off. We'll have some forums, and there's a lot of Bowser forums posted. So make sure you sign up for all the great trainings and forums coming up this summer. More to come with the WPA. I guess one kind of new twist. We've been doing the Water Resources Conference last couple of years with the special session. Got some feedback from the group here, and we're planning to do kind of a separate extended forum either in November, potentially January next year. Have kind of 4 or 5 hours of speakers and hopefully get quite a few more credits than we got from the last couple special sessions. So if you're interested in presenting, we're obviously taking speakers, and if you're considering doing a special session at the Water Resource Conference, we'll be sending some more information for requests for presenters as well. So I think that's all we had for today. Yes, thanks for coming out, and I'll hand it off to Dave and Mike.
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Berdash with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I'm a wetland biologist there for 20 years now, and developing Floristic quality assessment method and applying that in our statewide wetland quality status and trend survey called the Minnesota Wetland Condition Assessment. I'm not going to be talking about that today. We're going to talk more about an update on the functional assessment initiative done jointly with Minnesota and Wisconsin, but I'll dive into that in just a minute and let David introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. David Demmer with Minnesota Board of Water Resources. Wear a couple hats for the agencies. Probably guys know I co-coordinate the Minnesota Wetland Professional Certification Program along with my colleague back there, Ben Meyer. And then I also do cover the very tip of the arrowhead now, still as a wetland specialist. So I'll wear a couple of hats, be tag teaming this presentation along here with Mike. And I'm going to be talking mainly about the hydrogeomorphic method, and more specifically talking about some of the common indicators, wetland indicators, both hydric soil indicators as well as hydrology indicators that we see associated with HGM, kind of with the whole idea of trying to put together all the correlations right now between the HGM classification system and our work, you know, as wetland professionals out there doing wetland delineations and trying to determine the indicators that we find out there. Real quick though, before Mike dives in, I wanted to just do a quick, of course now it's not going to advance. Do a quick couple slides, and it's not advancing here either. Hold on. Hey Keller, did you, so are we sharing, or did it get changed then when I can manually do it?
I have to manually do it.
Hold on, I'm gonna run with this. We're gonna run with this one. I want to do a quick update on the MWPCP 2024 schedule, because I know there's a lot of interest right now. And I'm not gonna go through all these. For those of you who've already taken our virtual training or taken upcoming classes, you kind of already know what we have on the radar. A couple things I do want to highlight though, is that we have our introduction courses. Those are basically full. I think with the first one I should say is full. The second two have not opened yet. So we have a wait list right now on the Arden Hills, and then we're going to be opening up. We're doing staggered registration this year. So this summer we'll be opening up the last two. So just note, if you got folks in your office that need that introduction course, remember that's both delineation and regulation, that those two classes are be Johnny on the spot getting registered for those, because they fill up in minutes. So, but other things too to highlight this year is that we got this new TEP Academy coming next week, actually, up in St. Cloud. That's gonna be a good, just kind of crash course for any TEP members. But then the other one I wanted to highlight, that we still have spaces available is this delineation methods course. So this is just a 3-day class, just strictly based on wetland delineation. So just focus solely on the 3 parameters. There still is room for that in that class. So if you guys have colleagues who want to get their basic training done before the season gets in real full swing, we're offering it the end of May. So there's space in there. So just note that. Everything else you can see up there in our technical training, we're going to do a repeat of the FQA class here with Mike. We're going to do a repeat of Wetland Plant ID, this time doing one down here and then one up north of the Cloquet Forestry Center to try to get a different look at different ecological sections. And then we're going to do 2 sessions on the same day of the APT, the Antecedent Precipitation Tool. We're going to bring in some of our core colleagues. We're going to come in and talk about some of the background behind that and kind of just do teach everybody to run through that. So that's going to be pretty cool, exciting. One of those new tools that are kind of hopefully making our lives easier. If you're using it already, you know that. So just want to put a quick plug in for the 2024 WPCP schedule. Any real quick questions to that end? Cool. Hand it off to you.
Excellent.
Look clicker.
I'll just set it up here. Okay, so some of you folks might have seen a lot of this material at the Water Resources Conference this fall. So I apologize if you did, but when we were first talking about this, we thought, okay, it'd be good to do update on functional assessment. I do have a little bit more to offer than what I did cover in the fall. So there'll be some repeat material, but hopefully something new as well, because it's an ongoing project. But we always start at the top. So why are we interested in assessing wetland functions? Well, of course, it all goes back to our state and federal no net loss policy, where we are trying to achieve no net loss in the quantity, quality, and biological diversity of Minnesota's wetlands, right? And that's a broad policy, but when you get into the regulatory pieces, like in WACA and in 404, basically says our public values must be based upon wetland function. So we need to be looking at more of a functional piece when it comes to this. So you might be asking yourself, aren't there already functional assessment tools for Wisconsin and Minnesota? And the answer, of course, is yes. We have the MinRAM, and Wisconsin has the Wisconsin RAM. But both of those methodologies are over 20 years old. They're kind of like first generation wetland assessment methods. And obviously the science of wetland assessment has proceeded since then. A common criticism of the existing RAMs are that maybe they're too qualitative or they're too subjective for many regulatory purposes. As well as there is a movement in the 2008 federal mitigation rule and related state policies that call for increased need and improved functional assessment. And so the story is Ken Powell from Bowser and Tom Nedlin from Wisconsin DNR were at a Minnesota stream quantification tool workshop and said, we need to do something like this for wetlands in our states and we need to update our tools. And so our objectives are to develop a tool more applicable for regulatory implementation. So something that could be applied in during sequencing, assessing mitigation needs, and even assessing credits generated. There's obvious other applications for functional assessment tool, those being like conservation project planning, prioritization, implementation, and even my interest. So I do ambient statewide monitoring for overall status and trends. So these can be applied to our statewide survey as well. We want the tool to be more observation-based as opposed to the existing MinRAM, so that there's some pieces in those RAMs where it's more like, the user is making the interpretation of how good something is happening instead of maybe observing a condition on the ground. So we want to make it more observation-based. Obviously, we want to make it rapid. And when we're talking rapid here, we're using EPA's definition, which is takes a half a day in the office and a half a day in the field to complete. Now, you may argue whether or not that is rapid or not, but that's kind of the standard out in the literature. And obviously, we want to make it accessible to trained national resource professionals such as yourself. So those are our goals. We formed an initial steering committee. I'm a member of that committee of folks from Wisconsin and Minnesota. And so it's multi-agency here in Minnesota and then primarily Wisconsin DNR. When I got a program development grant in 2021, we formed technical teams where we invited a variety of folks into these technical teams to help start figuring out what this tool is going to be. I was the head of the hydrology team. David was nice enough to join our team and was a very good member. And so what we did, those technical teams were responsible to identify drivers, develop indicators and questions and thresholds. Talk a little bit more about that here in a second, as well as provide review and feedback. And then we brought on a consultant, formerly Cardinal, now Stantec, to provide facilitation, and they're responsible for drafting the final products, which we'll get to here in a second. So the overall organization of the tool is going to be by broad functional groups, and we have 5 of these groups. Hydrology, so specific functions under hydrology are like surface water attenuation, so that's the ability to slow waters, flood waters within a watershed. Surface water supply, that's things like, if you've ever heard of talking wetlands providing base flow for streams, that kind of type of functionality. Groundwater recharge. We have water quality functions, so your nutrient and sediment retention type of functionality, as well as shoreline stabilization, thermal regulation. Ecological, that's your fish and wildlife habitat, as well as maintaining native plant communities. Climate is going to be part of this, ability of a wetland to capture and store carbon. And then finally, a suite of anthropogenic, what we call anthropogenic, and that's like public use of wetlands. Now, all of these specific functions on here are supposed to relate back to something that is cited within both or either of Wisconsin or Minnesota statutes in terms of the functions and values that a wetland is supposed to represent. So that's how this list is essentially generated. So I just want to walk you through how we're thinking we're going to establish our assessment areas, or our AAs. It's basically like our study site. That is the area that you would be representing when you go out and do one of these functional assessments. Reason why we have to put some thought into this is that, right, wetlands often don't break into discrete units. In fact, it's more likely that, one wetland goes to another wetland, which goes to another one. So we have to come up with some kind of rules and guidelines to be able to, hopefully that people can come up with consistent assessment areas. General principles, we want these AAs to be applied at a larger scale. So we're thinking a lot of these kind of indicators operate kind of at larger scales. So often larger than, say, maybe an impact footprint for a specific project. And hydrogeomorphic classification is going to be important. And in fact, that's kind of why we ended up tag teaming on this presentation, because the thought here is that we're going to talk a little bit about some of the important classifications that are going to be necessary that are needed to be used within the tool, HGM being one of them. And we want these assessment areas to be relatively homogeneous in terms of their hydrology and vegetation. So, essentially, if we can have upland breakpoints, that's great, but otherwise the breakpoints will be based on HGM type, constrictions, things like beaver dams or roads, or even changes in vegetation. And we want to maximize our size out at 250 acres. So that's pretty big. We don't want anything bigger than that, but we'd still want our areas pretty big. So I'm just going to try to walk through a quick example that hopefully makes things a little more tangible for you. So the first step is, is to identify your area of interest. And so in this example, let's say we have, a lot of development, big box development, and another parcel is maybe proposed to being developed as well. And that's what's depicted in our red rectangle there. So we have our area of interest, and then next we want to delineate our contiguous wetland area. So if you zoom out, now you see that the rectangle is in kind of the lower left-hand corner, and you see this much larger contiguous wetland area. So when we're setting up our AA, we want to consider the larger area. We're going to determine our HGM type. In this case, let's say you go out there, and even though it's mapped as, a lot of it's mapped as PFOA, so A is your temporary flooded water regime. We have PMAs, PSSAs. You go out there and you see that there's actually a lot of organic soil out there. And so you interpret based on the ground of those conditions, you say, well, really we have more of a continuously saturated water regime, a D water regime. And so you might end up classifying this as an HGM organic flat as a broader piece. And so then we would want our AA to have that kind of whole contiguous area. So that's kind of the rough outline for how we're going to be setting up our assessment areas. Over the past, well, really 2 years, kind of went in this development phase of first identifying drivers, then indicators, and developing questions for all of our specific functions. And these were done independently by each tech team. So again, I led the hydro team. And then just try to break down some of the hierarchy for you guys. We're considering a driver in this context as being some sort of factor or ecological process that is changing how well a wetland performs a specific function. So an example would be for like surface water attenuation, what's the outlet configuration of that wetland, right? Is there a ditch coming out of it, or is there some sort of topographic contour that ponds water, something like that. And then we change that driver, or we develop that into more of a tangible indicator or some observable characteristic that you can see in a wetland, and then form that into a question and try to come up with some meaningful categories. Our overall goal here is to hopefully reflect qualitatively meaningful relative differences here. So at the end of the day, with the assessment method, it's not gonna be able to say like, oh, wetland A can store X gallons more water than wetland B. That's way more specific than what we're trying to get at. We're basically trying to say qualitatively, based on a number of characteristics, wetland A might provide high capacity for storing water versus wetland B. That's kind of the level we're shooting for. And then we break these indicators up into, when applicable, if they're related more to functional capacity versus opportunity and value. So think of functional capacity as like the ability of the wetland to do a specific function. And the opportunity and value is again, opportunity to do that function, as well as kind of the societal context, right? That's where the value of this comes in, is that we need to have some direct addressing of how this is valuable to our society. And then finally, identify primary versus secondary importance for these indicators. So some like functional capacity indicators are going to be the drivers of whether a function is done well or not, and others are going to be sort of secondary, and that kind of breaks into the scoring. So an example of this, to just walk through I guess we don't have a mouse here, do we? Walk through the indicators for our surface water attenuation function. So in terms of functional capacity, our primary indicators are going to be HGM type, like whether It's a depressional system versus a riverine system versus flat. And the outflow characteristics of a site. Our secondary indicators will be water regime, as in how much water is already in the wetland. Is there more opportunity, or is there more capacity for storage within the wetland typically? Through flow complexity, so how fast does water move through the wetland in terms of just sheet flow, and then soil permeability. Our opportunity value indicators are going to be our land use within the immediate catchment. So if you think about it, developed landscapes, we have a lot of wetland drainage already. So existing wetlands, any storage that they provide in terms of attenuation here is highly valued, right? As opposed to if you're an intact landscape, maybe we don't necessarily value the storage of every wetland as much as we would as in a more developed landscape. And then secondary indicators would be like conveyances. Is water being purposefully routed to that wetland for the purposes of being attenuated? And then our AA to immediate catchment ratio. So that hopefully gives a flavor of that. And I just had an example here. So let's say we have a depressional wetland. It's a shallow marsh kind of community. It's seasonally flooded. And our outflow from that system is kind of an intermittent or saturated soil outflow. There isn't any like stream coming out of it or anything. We're in kind of a mixed agricultural landscape. So since this is a depressional system, we have a topographic contour there that's actually catching surface water, right? That actually starts to push it in that higher functional capacity. And then given the mixed landscape, it's probably somewhere as like a medium opportunity value. So this is kind of where we're headed with the output for this thing. Knowledge, skills, and abilities. So a goal for in the development of this is we're trying to make it so that we don't require users to have like ESRI licensing and things like that, as well as we don't have the budget to do any sort of IT development. And while we already know that Excel spreadsheets are pretty widely available. So the tool is going to be put on an Excel spreadsheet, and we are gearing it towards using EPA's Enviro Atlas to do the GIS work. Now, of course, if you have your own capabilities to do that, obviously you can mimic those kind of capabilities on your own, but we wanted to make it more open for folks to just be able to do the assessment. So you're going to need to know, you have at least have access to EPA's Enviro Atlas, which is, you know, a web-based GIS application that's served up. It actually has some really great tools. The screenshot on here is an elevation tool that can be used to figure out a relative position of the wetland in terms of its hydrologic position. So you see a yellow line in there, that's the Huck 12 break. And if you take a elevation profile from your Huck 12 break to kind of the general flow path, you would say, well, is that wetland kind of high in that local watershed position? Is it medium or is it low? If it's high, it could be more important in terms of groundwater recharge. If it's lower, it's either a pass through or it's a discharge kind of situation. So our being knowledgeable, of course, of our National Wetland Inventory is going to be useful, using Web Soil Survey, HGM classification, coordinate water regimes. That's also going to be covered later on today. Plant community classification, that's going to be covered today as well. That comes in terms of our rapid FQA. That is going to be a big piece of the ecological tool. And then being able to do physical habitat observations. So I wanted to just take a quick transition over to how the spreadsheet is looking. If I can find it here. As mentioned before, we are gonna be putting the tool, at least to begin with, on a spreadsheet. This is the latest clean version that I just received from the consultant yesterday. So we're in the process right now of getting this spreadsheet built, getting our questions and scoring figured out. We're not quite done yet, but I just wanted to be able to kind of show you guys that, hopefully give you a flavor of what this thing is gonna look like, at least generally. So you're gonna have tabs at the bottom. There's a, first page is your basic info page. But mostly when you guys are gonna be doing this kind of work, it'll be done on this AA data entry tab. And so this entry tab will be, partially done in the office and partially done in the field. That's the basic idea. I just kind of kicked in a quick example. Let's say we're at a 20-acre depressional wetland. We have a ditch in and out with a control structure there. It's mostly cattails with a little bit of reed canary grass around the fringe. And we're in a WPA with some buffer grasses around it, but otherwise generally an ag landscape. And we're in Douglas County, Minnesota. So, obviously you'd have put in information, size information, these kinds of things. It does some calculations for you. You enter in your HGM class. This will be a depression. We'll have drop-down menus. The EnviroAtlas tool has some land use analysis capabilities where you do some drawings and it will tally up NLCD coverages, and those will be entered in kind of this spot here. I just entered in some dummy variables, and then you'll start seeing questions like this on different pieces of EnviroAtlas, things about the catchment area, hydrology. So here's a piece to enter in your water regimes for your site. Let's say that this is primarily, again, seasonally flooded with maybe a little temporarily flooded around the edge with some reed canary grass. Groundwater usage, seeps, things of that nature. So, I'm sure you guys have seen these kinds of questions before, right? So here's this one. Question 27, characterize surface water flow received by the AA. And then, you'd have these different options here. Let's see, outlet. So these are all water questions. We have a number of questions that will get blocked out if, depending on your answer. So some of these questions are only answered in certain situations, like if you're in a riverine HGM type, things like that. So we're trying to make the spreadsheet smart enough so you don't have to answer those kinds of questions when it's not warranted. We have some places in here to enter in soil survey information. What's this? % organic matter, and then we have our KSAT, hydraulic conductivity. Then we get into more vegetation, kind of structural kind of things. In terms of using rapid FQA, we're thinking that's going to continue to be used as like an independent product, and then you just take the answer from that and enter it into here. And then that would flow then into the rest of the assessment. Again, some structural vegetation things, habitat questions, and then we have a whole long series of, our kind of cultural value questions. Is this, like a hunting area, that kind of thing. Again, we're in tabular form. If you want to click through each of the functional groups, these tabs should show you how the points kind of lay out, and will kind of show some of the explanations of the scores. But really what you want to get to in the end is this results summary. And we want this to be kind of hierarchical. So we start by ratings or rankings by each group. But then we have really the specific function. So the breakdown of each specific function underneath that. So when you have these groups, right? So like for the hydrology, it's going to take like the best of those three individual ones and put it as the highest ranking for that group. And where it makes sense, there's different ratings for functional capacity versus opportunity value. It's for some of these groups, it's one or the other. Like we thought for climate, there isn't really an opportunity value because climate is everywhere, right? Like there's no real context. We value that universally. So there's no real differences in terms of value. In terms of the anthropogenic functions, right? None of those are really functional capacity. Those are all basically some sort of anthropogenic value, right? Anyway, so we see this kind of spreadsheet. So maybe let's just walk through the hydro functions, how they turned out at this particular site. So remember, we're talking like 20-acre depressional wetland, marsh vegetation, you know, ditch in and out. We have a control structure. And the way it came out is in terms of functional capacity for our hydro is all kind of in the moderate. If we want to get to like the highest functional capacity for water attenuation would be like a wetland without a surface water connection, right? So everything it captures, it holds within that wetland. And a low rated one would be like a floodplain where the water comes in, but then quickly rushes out once the flooding goes down. Anyway, I'm not gonna go through bit by bit. I just wanted to give you guys a flavor for that. And of course, maybe we can ask questions about it later. Let's dip back to the presentation here. Okay, so timeline, next steps. Yeah, for the past 6 months or so, we've been trying to consolidate and finalize our questions, develop our assessment frameworks and the scoring, and develop this into the tool spreadsheet. And it continues today. That is still ongoing. But we're hopeful to have a pretty good working version by May. And then the technical team will be doing an internal testing period. And then hopefully by June through July, we will be doing like a public notice. And I believe that's how Ken wants to do it, but we'll try to communicate that to the WPA and release that so folks can do beta testing and provide review and feedback. So that will be your opportunity to take a look at this and agree with the things that you like and disagree with the things that you don't like. And also point out even like small technical pieces like, hey, the spreadsheet is wonky here, or why would you rate something like this? And then give us a citation and tell us the good science behind why you think something should be different, because we want this tool to be the best it can be, but it has been a group making or a group kind of production here. And so sometimes it's hard to make sure all the pieces are connecting just right. But then hopefully by late summer and early fall, we'll get into tool revision and an official release of version 1.0. Questions on the functional tool assessment?
The AA that you had delineated blue line earlier in the presentation, it had a number of different plant communities that also probably have different hydrologic regimes, presumably. But that's all the AA that you're assessing, or you break it down into subgroups, or how do you deal with that?
Sure, that is a great question. So we're gonna say that the HGM type is the bigger piece that we want to look at. The different plant communities and water regimes within that, you can have multiple water regimes and multiple plant communities. So think of like a classic depressional where you have some meadow, some marsh, and some water in the middle, right? That's all one depressional basin, right? So we would want our AA to be that whole basin, but obviously there's different pieces with I've been muted the whole time.
No, I think, can you hear us now? Well, thanks for sticking with us. Any questions for Mike? All right.
Okay, how are we doing for time? Doing okay?
Good.
Yeah. We just want to transition quickly into talk about classification. Also, I mentioned in the first portion there, right, that HGM classification is going to be important, water regime is going to be important, plant community. And so just wanted to start off by talking a little.
It was well for the first hour. So. Can you hear us now? Keeps auto muting.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll
Can
keep
you hear
checking
me?
it, but yeah, we
Okay.
got audio.
Okay. Thanks,
keep
everybody. Is it like trying to power?
Yeah.
Is there a loose plug or something?
Going crazy on the camera for a second. I'll be good now, but I'll
Great, okay, so we'll try to move ahead then. Okay.
Someone said Demrick broke it.
Okay, why wetland classification? So, right, over the years, there have been many definitions of wetlands, right? I'm showing one definition of the screens. Comes from coordinate 1979, so this is the coordinate system that was developed for NWI mapping, right? Which, informed kind of our current, way that we define that through the core with the three parameters, right? Where we have hydrology, and if we have hydrosoil and we have hydrovegetation, we have a wetland, right? So the definitions generally are always pretty simple, right? But it covers a huge universe and huge variability of things, right? It covers a great deal of different processes as well as, ecologic structures and things like that. So anyone, you don't have to be a trained natural resource professional like yourself, can look at these three pictures and go, these things are really different from each other, even though they're all wetlands, right? And so that's why we have wetland classification. Basically, there's a common goal. We want to try to reduce natural variability. We want to try to group things that are like to each other as a way to increase our understanding of those things, right? And of course, with wetland classification systems, there are many. I don't mingle that often with other ecologists, but it seems like wetland folks seem to have more classification systems than others. And they can be confusing, right? And sometimes contradictory. Well, I really think that is largely for two different reasons. One is whenever a classification system is kind of thought up and invented, right? They're usually developed independent from each other for different reasons and are focused on different aspects of wetlands. Concepts, right? So there's always some similarities, but then there's always some differences. And then two, like, it's just a reflection of how complex the wetland universe is, right? So it's a complex thing that we're trying to reel in. So we're going to be talking today about three systems. The HGM system. HGM incorporates really three factors: the geomorphic setting, which is your landform and topographic position, water source, and hydrodynamics. And so again, the purpose of HGM classification is to do wetland functional assessment. That was the whole point when this was developed. And in my mind, if you're classifying a wetland according to an HGM type, what you're really doing is interpreting why that wetland exists in the first place. It talks about the water, and it's essentially figuring out why this thing is here, which I think is pretty cool. In terms of definitive sources, I always point back to Smith et al. 1995. So this was got the same work group as Brinson. Everybody cites Brinson, but if you want to see the actual definitions of what's a depression, what's a riverine, it's in this document, Smith et al., as well as concepts developed by Nowitzki, which have been recently put in the wetland restoration guide. That's it. And so those are kind of the concepts we're going to be keying in on today. Coordinate water regime. So water regime is really a description of the long-term duration and timing of surface water inundation, as well as saturation of water at or below the surface, right? So this is part of the coordinate classification system. We know that's a hierarchical system. This is called a modifier. So it's tacked on at the end, but honestly, it spans across different systems and classes, right? So it's pretty important. One thing to always remember when thinking about water regime is that wetland hydrology is your most variable or ephemeral wetland parameter, right? Water is always variable, and we're trying to put it in a box in terms of what's our long-term kind of water regime. And again, the purpose for this system was NWI mapping, but it can be very useful in other applications. And our definitive source here is the Federal Geographic Data Committee publication from 2013. So this is our federal wetland mapping standard. So if you want to know what the classes are, how they are defined, it's in this document. And I'm just going to briefly run through the different water regimes, and I'm only going to focus on the most common ones. There are more, but these are the ones that show up in NWI maps. So first off, we have temporarily flooded. That's where we have surface water for a brief period of time. There's often a seasonality to it, right? Often this happens early in the year. But for the rest of the year, the water table is usually well below the surface, right? And this is because of the seasonality. I think this is often confused with the seasonally flooded water regime. Let's talk about the sea or seasonally flooded water regime. This is surface water present for extended periods greater than 1 month. And then our soil surface is typically saturated when it's not being inundated. So a sea water regime is going to be much wetter than an A water regime typically. And then how about our D, continuously saturated water regime? So it's another letter on the scale, but I would say that this is drier than your seawater regime. The continuously saturated water regime is where you have saturation at the soil surface for extended periods of time. Inundation is typically rare, so this is where you have a lot of peat forming wetlands in this kind of water regime. And again, it's drier than your seawater regime. So you can see where the kind of the confusion. Finally, the deeper water regimes, F, G, and H. You can see in the picture here, we at least have H and F. So think about, open water systems are going to be G and H. The difference between those two is G will actually dry out every once in a while on your most extreme drought years, whereas H is water all the time. And then F is usually you have standing water and usually in kind of an emergent plant community for extended periods of time throughout the year in most years. So that was just a brief rundown of the water regimes. And finally, I'll just briefly introduce agri plant communities. I'm sure you guys know these. Again, just generally a plant community is an assemblage of plant species that are coexisting in a similar environment, right? In this system, there are definitely overlapping concepts with both water regime and to some degree HGM types. And that's what we're gonna kind of close with, is the intersectionality of all of these concepts, because they kind of, in some areas overlap, some areas they are kind of distinct from one another. And that's, I think where they overlap that's an area for confusion on that. And so just to wrap before I turn it over to David, a few things to keep in mind when we were talking classification. I always call it a Goldilocks problem, right? For any kind of classification that you're using, if you have too few classes, you might be, missing important variation that exists in the landscape that you're trying to describe. But if you have too many classes, right, at best it becomes more difficult to implement, right? Because you're trying to make finer distinctions out there. But at its worst, you might have distinction without a true difference, right? So what we're always trying to find is some sort of happy medium. We're trying to have our classification scheme to be just right. A few words about our 2019 National Wetland Inventory update. I'm sure you guys are aware that not only does it have the full coordinate mapping, but we have simplified HGM and plant community classification along with that. And these are all awesome, great tools and great places to begin with. But one word is that with the water regimes, it's part of the coordinate system and it's part of the national mapping standard. And it's a very robust system, right? And it's been around since the late 70s. And my take is generally it is greater than 90% accurate what you see on the map for what you can see on the ground, which is the goal of these mapping products, right? Is try to be close to, nothing's ever going to be perfect, right? But be really good. And I would say the simplified HGM and plant community classification, it's definitely related to the classic concepts of HGM and definitely related to Eggers and Reed, but it had to be simplified for a purpose, right? It had to be simplified to be used as a mapping product. And I would say in general, this is less than a 90% accuracy. It's not quite as robust. And that makes sense too, because it's not as a well-developed system. So that to be aware of, and that kind of moves into the final point, is that we're always striving for a more perfect interpretation out there. This interpretation is inherent in all of this. And the best way to go about this is to combine ground verification, things you can observe on the ground, with the NWI information and full photography interpretation. That's going to be your best, most accurate approach. It's really kind of a three-legged stool here. You have to make it to get a consistent classification there, have more consistency, right? You have to have some sort of objective observation that other people can see and see the same way as you. You have to know the context of that observation, right? Are you in normal precipitation conditions, or has it just rained 5 inches in the past 2 weeks? And then finally, understanding the classes, that like trying to minimize the confusion of, okay, am I in an A water regime or a C water regime? Those kinds of things. You got to have all three of those things to be able to consistently apply any kind of classification. And finally, there's always going to be some eye of the beholder. It's not entirely avoidable, right? There's always going to be, you always get cases where there's going to be integrating characteristics, and you have very qualified people and skilled people that might come up with different interpretations, and they might both be right. And that's part of the game as well. So I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to talk more about how to make this all happen.
Talk with the eye of the beholder, right?
Eye of the beholder.
And finding that perfect observation. I was kind of chuckling because that's the goal of the MWPCP, is to consistently train people to come up with the exact same observation, right? All right, so you did our advanced app. Yeah, so what I want to do with this is kind of step back a bit. Mike just talked about the functional assessment initiative, talked a little bit about what we've got established in our classification systems. especially talking about water regime and the water regime modifier in the coordinate system. One of my goals here this afternoon with this part of the presentation is to kind of bring that back into the context of what we are all trained to do in wetland delineations. So I'm going to start by going over what the hydrogeomorphic method is, HGM, what it's built on. But really what I want to do then is dive into the individual classes and talk about the observations we can make in the field that we're doing anyways with wetland delineation, and what that can tell us not only about making that consistent determination of which HGM class we are, but also give us those clues about what the condition is, what the true function going on at that site with some of the observations that we can make from the soils and the hydrology indicators that we can observe. So I'm going to take a little bit deeper dive into the HGM classes. But first, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. Mike talked about kind of the formation back in the 90s. Brimson gets a lot of credit. Smith, obviously, Nowitzki. Those are some of the names, the technical minds that kind of came up with this. I like the analogy that HGM tells us why a wetland is there. I'm a geologist who kind of just mistakenly found his way into the wetland world. And so when I approach a site, for those of you who have been on the field with me, you know that I'm reading the landscape first and foremost before I'm even looking around and seeing what plants are around me, what kind of soils I'm digging up with the auger. And I think that HGM kind of gives us that analogy, or it gives us some of the HGM provides us the context to look at a site, put together the parameters that we're using to determine what HGM class is. But even better, because we're wetland delineators and we're looking at kind of the big picture, right, with all of our parameters, we're able to then observe characteristics about that landscape that kind of ties it all together. So HGM itself is this function, it assesses the actual functional conditions of a wetland, right? Why it's there, how water is moving through it, why is it on that landscape position, why is it within that surface shape. It also talks too about why the water is moving through that the way it is. So really dives in classifying based on actual functions. So that geomorphology, hydrology or water source that Mike was talking about, but also too how it loses water, right? So geomorphology, hydrology, and then the hydraulics. So what it does is based off those three parameters, another three parameters, right, to think about, we have these classes. So there are 7 classes. 6 of them are found within Minnesota. The obvious one that's not is here, the estuarine fringe. Functionally, the estuarine fringe is much like the lacustrine fringe, so that's a lake fringe. The only difference is the water chemistry is obviously different, and the actual energy levels, because you're talking about being near an ocean, can often be pretty extreme as well, where typically, with maybe the exception of this Lake Superior lacustrine fringe, the water energy levels are relatively low. So we've got riverine, so those are near rivers. We got depression or depressional, depending on which source you're looking at. Those are actually those terms you see the depressional use sometimes, other times depression. Slope or sloped, mineral soil flats, organic soil flats, and then lacustrine fringe are all found in Minnesota. One thing that I appreciate about HGM is that it actually transcends all the systems that coordinate has. Especially when you add in the estuarine fringe, all of the systems that coordinate has are laid out and can be identified or classified with these 7 HGM classes. So when we're talking about HGM, there are also subclasses. Now, I should step back and say all of this is an emerging science, right? So when you dive into it, there is not actually a lot of white paper out there. There's not a lot of technical academic work. There's also not a lot of government white papers out there in the whole scheme of things. So what we are learning, the more we dig into this, is kind of classic scientists, is that we're further breaking these classes down into subclasses. In Minnesota, the subclasses really come in with sloped and depression wetlands. And the difference is their hydrology inputs and outputs. So for example, the top example are both depression wetlands. You can see the concave depression surface, right? But what the difference is that the one here on the left has this groundwater component. The groundwater component is both input, as well as in certain conditions, this could be even broken down more complex, of course, can also be an output as well. Versus the one on the right is simply a surface water fed depression. But note one big difference is that it loses water through the ground. And that's actually a relatively rare thing. When we're talking about wetland functions, one thing that is true is that there are only really a couple wetland classes in the HGM class that have groundwater recharge potential. So think about that. Those of you who do water planning, I think you can appreciate that's a pretty important fact, right? So there are these subclasses. It's important to understand these subclasses, but let's look at the classes, the higher level of looking at HGM. So we got 3 parameters. We got geomorphology. When I say geomorphology, I'm talking about landscape position and surface shape, right? So where you are in the whole scheme of things in your watershed and where you are in terms of the land form, the shape of that land form. The hydrology, a good old college textbook, right? Your inputs and your outputs. I'll talk a little bit about some of the complexities, especially when we're applying a hydrology indicator, about how that's fleeting, right? Hydrology is fleeting. It's their shortest term evidence of the 3 parameters of wetland delineation. But then the hydraulics. So how the water is actually moving through a site. And, you know, for a lot of us, when we do a typical wetland delineation, we really aren't looking at that per se, are we? But the complexity in understanding how water is moving through a landscape can really help us kind of figure out functions, especially when you have something relatively simple and uniform as this simple single direction horizontal movement of water through the ground, popping out at this break in the slope. And of course there we'd have aqueic conditions, right, or wet conditions. So these are the 3 parameters that define the HGM classification system. Now, I just really quickly, and I could talk about this all day, right? Longer than that. For those of you who have been in the 5-day class, you know that. I just really want to quickly point out something about the state of Minnesota, because I think we can all appreciate how diverse this state is. Consultants who travel around doing work all across the state know that we sit at a really cool spot ecologically speaking and hydrologically speaking. And that fact is because of the result of our glacial geology, right? In Minnesota, glacial geology defines our geomorphology. So when we're talking about glacial geology in Minnesota, I just want to hone in real quick on the Wisconsin the last episode, the Wisconsin glaciation, the last advance of ice to come over. There are really 3 main advances that happened in the state during the Wisconsin glaciation, so about 10 to 15,000 years ago. But what it did, it left us all of this to work with. And all the complexities and all the landforms and all the parent material that we're left with was directly a result of those 3 advances of the last Wisconsin glaciation. So the first thing that happened was the Wadena lobe crashed through, basically coming straight out of the north. That left us the western fringe of the Alexandria moraine and the Wadena drumlin field. The next thing that happened is that the Superior lobe came out of the Lake Superior Basin, brought a very different parent material due to the iron-rich substrate that it was coming out of, but it also brought us this additional layer of complexity with that Itasca moraine wrapping down to the St. Croix moraine. The next thing that happened was that the Des Moines lobe came through and had this kind of multi-pronged advance over. This was during when the continental glacier was starting to melt away. It was just kind of these little fringes, these little fingers of the continental ice sheet that just kind of poked through, both in parts that were already carved out, the easy stuff, but also made this really large advance, leaving us the Bemis moraine, really defined the Alexandria moraine, kind of gave us some of this upland moraine, highland moraine, that now when we see it, you can see all the different main landforms that define our state right now. And this is really important for us in the way we think about wetland delineations, because one, if my next couple screens would lead into how this all directly correlates with our ecological sections. And that correlation that happens there. But also too, for us as wetland scientists, especially when looking at the soils, this also gives us an idea of why the soil is the color it is, or why that texture is really fine and that texture is really coarse. Well, it's all directly tied to the last glaciation and the landforms that we now interpret when we're talking about geomorphology and HGM classification. So, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. I should have forgotten the lakes, right? So these are just generic. You can see on the left there, it's all labeled, but also really important, especially, well, here with the Anoka sampling and up in my neck of the woods, or Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was ginormous. This is only just a little sliver of it that I'm showing here. We have a lot of these lake plains, right? So really fine material that now we see some of our big peatland areas. Okay. So that's geomorphology. Hydraulics in these systems that we're talking about, the 6 that are found in Minnesota, there's 2 types of hydraulics that we're talking about when we're talking about HGM. We have our unidirectional flow, like the diagram here. I think I killed the battery. It's not letting me point lasers anymore. The single direction, unidirectional flow, relatively straightforward, typically following some kind of geologic formation, right? Or maybe not geologic, but other substrate, like maybe a lens of sand from glacial remains. But also too, along our lakes, we have this bidirectional flow. So here we have the overland flow coming from, you know, the catchment around it, and also too the lake level, which also kind of keeps that uniform lake level. And when there's less flow coming in, the lake level kind of pushes back, right? Recharges those wetlands. So when we're talking about hydraulics, again, it's more difficult typically to see it when you're actually out. You're not usually making field observations that give you these clues unless you're doing some monitoring, hydrology monitoring. But the key takeaway for wetland professionals is know that most hydraulics are moving through a wetland in a relatively uniform, unidirectional, single direction. But then there are situations, especially around our lake fringes, where there is that bidirectional flow. So this is kind of just the table I broke up. You can kind of see where we have our HGM classes. We have subclasses, and you can see the differences and the similarities on the hydrology inputs and outputs. And then note how the hydraulics, most of them are unidirectional, right? With those exceptions. So when we're talking about hydrology, again, this is the college textbook that I think we're all very familiar with. I won't belabor this topic at all, but what I want to press on you is the concept that I know we all observe, and we all anecdotally understand this, is that as you move through a water season, as you move through the hydrologic cycle of a year, you could be looking at the exact same basin and observing very different things, right? So this is why we say hydrology is so fleeting. When you are in the winter, when you're out of the growing season, there's not a lot of energy in the air. The trees don't have their leaves on, so there's very low evapotranspiration. The storage capacity is very limited because the ground is frozen, right? But as you move through the growing season, that changes really quickly. Temperatures get warmer, there's more energy in the atmosphere, there's more precipitation. The plants have leaves, so they're transpiring, doing their business. They're actively growing. In the fall, again, the temperatures drop, storage decreases, ground starts to freeze again, plants lose their leaves. But in the end, for wetland delineators, obviously we're doing our delineation, right? Preferably right here in the growing season. So what we need to understand is there is going to be an extent of where we're going to see the hydrology indicators, right? With the furthest upland, inland, if you will, extent being those temporary flooded areas that Mike was talking about, all the way down. So when we observe, make an observation on our data sheet, writing down what hydrology indicator we're observing, that is just a snapshot in time, right? That's for hydrology indicators. Soils are also developing, right? Hydric soils develop over time. So as we walk through and make a note that, hey, our water levels, we're just seeing a snapshot in time. This spring day, oh, there's my laser back. This spring day here along the Snake River outside of Mora, sweet. Look at it, it's flooded. I'm gonna see some evidence there, right? Or, hey, I'm in the end of the growing season, right? And I'm sitting in this bog outside of Cloquet, but look, this thing is saturated still, really heavily saturated, continuously saturated. So while the hydrology is those different water levels and the evidence that we're seeing from those different water levels are really just a snapshot in time, really fleeting, those groups and the way we group our hydrology indicators give us clues about the duration of it all. So when we have, for those of you who I think basically everybody in this room is very familiar with how we have grouped our hydrology indicators from group A to D, right? Where group A are what we call those slam dunk indicators, right? They're direct observation of water, whether it's surface or saturation. As you move down to group B, C, D, you start to get to a little bit less obvious evidence, right? Soil cracks. They're evidence that that was ponded or flooded before, right? It's not, the water's not there, but it's giving us a clue that that happened back in time. All the way to when you get to group D, those are just some characteristics that we can observe on the landscape or within the plant communities that tell us that there were wetland conditions. So think about these groups here. And as I walk through the actual HGM classes, I'm going to throw up tables that show what the common indicators are for those HGM classes. And think about how you can be in a single wetland and observe group A or group D indicators at the same time. Now, that very well might be just because of the exact time that you are up there, you actually see that saturation. Or it might be because you're just seeing evidence of that full extent of the hydrology indicators that I showed in that previous slide. So while hydrology is fleeting, hydric soils don't happen overnight, right? They develop in time in those aqueic conditions, right? Those saturated conditions. So I always like to say that soils don't lie, right? Sorry guys, but sometimes veg lies to us, right? We know that, right? We know that hydrology is fleeting. Sometimes that doesn't get us the full picture, but soils don't lie because they take time. So they need these anaerobic or void of free oxygen conditions to slowly develop by basically a two-pronged process, depending on the scenario. We have this reduction process, and then we have this organic matter accumulation. This is the foundation of the field indicator manual, right? This is the foundation of how we have determined what a hydric soil indicator is. But the next step past that is to understand what that indicator can tell us about the actual hydrologic conditions, or even better, what the geomorphic conditions, or maybe even the glacial geology of that site was. So these indicators can give us all sorts of clues that when coupled with the rest of the parameters can really start to make a complete picture for us. So when we're talking about hydric soil development under these aqueic conditions, we have this whole range, right? Where those of you who've been walking down a Katina, cutting different soil profiles out, you know that you could transition very quickly from evidence of an upland soil, something that's never saturated, all the way through something that might be something that's given you see redox in there, you see something that's been frequently saturated, all the way down to if you're in a lake or a river even, something that's laid out, right? A permanently saturated area. Keep pointing because my laser sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So sorry if I'm just like doing this and nothing's there. So what we actually see in the field can help us give clues. So these are real soil pits from across the state. This one on the right these are all Katinas, so different profiles taken continuous along a single landform. This is out of the prairie pothole area, actually right, I should say, this is right on the fringe of, this is outside of Fergus Falls. So as we're working on the northern edge of the Alexandria moraine going down into the Great Plains. And what you see is you got your typical upland soils here. But as you walk through going down, you're going into an inundated wetland where the clues start to really become striking as you go further down that landform. You start to lose your upland characteristics. You start to see an organic accumulation, right? Because there is no free oxygen. Decomposition is slowing. So all the plant matter just starts accumulating because it's continuously or permanently saturated or inundated until you finally get down to the wetland basin where it's all very, very lightly decomposed organic matter. It's very thick. A single plug of that, and you will just find how thick this stuff can get. I think we can all appreciate how thick of organic accumulation we can find in certain parts of the state in those areas that are permanently inundated. So you contrast that to the saturated conditions where it could take a different look, right? Especially when you're in more of a mineral substrate and less of an organic substrate. The Katina here above, on the right, I should say, has some organics to it. But mainly what you're seeing is evidence within those mineral layers of that reduction process and less of the organic accumulation process. So even all the way on the far left here, this is way deep into the wetland. This is all the way in the middle of the wetland. And really, if you started to texture this stuff out, you have organics up to here. But on this right here, the second one from the left, where the wetland line is right here, you only have like 6 inches of organics above it. The rest is all mineral. The picture all the way on the left there is just straight from the surface. That's just an 8-inch auger there. And really, you're hardly seeing anything in terms of organics. You're seeing mainly mineral. In fact, this is kind of a clay loam. But the hydric soil indicators that we're picking up are much different, right? Redox dark surface is what we find there. So depending if you're in an inundated condition or a saturated condition, your indicators are going to vary greatly, right? So let's look at depression wetlands then. And notice how I have to break this table up into the fact, recognizing the fact that depression wetlands can have 3 different typical hydrology regimes, right? Now, I'm going to say this now because this is a ginormous caveat that I want to put on all of the remaining slides here, is that these are common indicators or indicators that can be common to these water regimes. The reality is that I would be absolutely shocked if a data sheet showed every single one of these for a saturated depression wetland. The reality is you might check 1, you might check 2 right at that boundary, but these are all the indicators that you could find in that saturated hydrology regime in a depression wetland. Okay, so let's look at it. Let's start with the hydrology indicators. Because you can see how in a depression, depending on where you are in that water regime, you can have very different types of indicators, right? If you are in a seasonally flooded and you're there when it's flooded, you will see surface water, A1. You shouldn't really expect to see that though if in your saturated regime, right? Because it's not flooded, but you might see A2, that high water table. Those are kind of the obvious slam dunk ones, right? As you walk through though, and especially as you get into the C and the D groups, those same indicators might be more fleeting. And sometimes they're actually even more specific to that particular classification. And I'll show you an example. There's a couple of real good ones here later that you really only see that indicator in that situation. Depression's not as much. One thing I would point out though with this is that look down at the semi-permanently flooded. Well, obviously that duration of inundation is prolonged, right? So that's where we would expect to see the most organic accumulation. So that's why we expect to see our thicker organic indicators like A1 histosol or A2 histic epipeta, right? So if you saw that histosol in a mineral flat, for example, that would be a red flag to me. So as you might look at this in cross-section for a depression wetland, you would see this katina kind of play out this way. This is kind of similar to that slide I was showing with the full katina. I'll start in the middle of the basin because, yeah, that is where you're likely going to have the most prolonged saturation or inundation. That's where you should expect to see your thickest organic accumulation. That's where you should expect to see your histosol. As you work your way out onto the wetland boundary, that's going to change, right? To a point where you're going to go from your thick, dark surface here. Well, yeah, because there's a fair amount of organics or just dark material over that mineral. To a point where if you're all the way on the fringe, and really, right, this is where we spend our time as wetland delineators right here, we might only pick up that redox dark surface out there on the fringe. We're mainly a mineral. We're not in an area that's inundated very long, so we don't have that organic accumulation. But that water picks up there long enough to get those redox features. We have a dark enough surface. That's our wetland boundary. That's where we spend a lot of our time, right? So as you move through and look at sloped, my personal favorite, because I like hilly stuff, that's why I live up on the North Shore, it could get pretty complicated. We typically see saturation with sloped wetlands. But what we often see, if there's a groundwater component to sloped wetlands, is that these sometimes are permanently saturated. This picture here, where it's a groundwater influence, if you have that continual input of hydrology, you have time to still form that thick organic histosol. You have all the other components of those primary hydrology indicators of a high water table, saturation. You might even be in a calcium carbonate rich parent material and be able to see marl deposits. So there's a number of factors that when we look at what actual indicators we pick up on a data sheet can give us clues to things like parent material, like with these marl that you see coming out of the surface here. So what we might find here is down at the base, well into the wetland, you might have that histosol. Maybe it's a calc fen, right? Basically permanently saturated, get time to form that histosol. And as you work your way out, all the way up here, again, where we spend our time, you might just be picking up on that redox dark surface. And that did turn out blurry, that scale. So mineral flats, apart from being, in my opinion, some of the most difficult wetlands to delineate, mineral flats can also be very complicated with respect to the indicators you might get. You might find one at one spot, walk 20 feet, be in the exact same basin, and get a whole different suite of indicators. So the reason for that is that mineral flats experience a whole variety of hydrology regimes. Anything basically except for permanently flooded. Typically, especially in the clay pan lake bed areas of the Northeast where I do my work, you typically are just experiencing saturation. Usually it's just simply surface fed water that's perched. You might have some microtopography or something else going on with that, but it's typically a saturated regime. And I typically look for my B and C indicators when I'm looking at mineral flats. Occasionally, you're doing my favorite where you're looking at D indicators like geomorphic position and fact neutral. But oftentimes, especially in a pretty good saturated wetland, you're looking at B and C indicators for saturated mineral flat wetlands. But you can see that there's a whole variety of both hydrology indicators and soil indicators you might find. Oftentimes, at least again in my neck of the woods, I'm typically looking at a saturation in A3, water stain leaves, geomorphic position, shallow aquitard, or fact neutral. Those are kind of the typical, what I see most often on data sheets in Northeast Minnesota. With the soil indicators, I will typically see sometimes you'll see A11, not as much thick dark surface, but F1, loamy mucky mineral, depleted matrix, or sandy redox if you're getting more into central Minnesota or southern Minnesota in this neck of the woods. That's what we typically see. So again, giving us evidence, not as much of that prolonged deep water, but the prolonged saturated conditions where the soils will just kind of take on those redox features mainly. So these could be confusing, right? Pretty flat, not much going on in that landscape. Hydraulically, this is what we refer to as a vertical system. So it's just simply bringing water in from precip, losing water out through ET. But look at how complicated it can be on the site. You can be in this forested area right here and just pick up a little redox dark, or you can walk just another step over into an area where there might be just a micro depression where maybe there was a little bit of ponding. And hey, I got loamy, mucky mineral. Or you can go off and kind of get just pretty common, typical one that I probably see is the most common would be a redox dark surface. But the landscape can really be a difficult one to interpret with these mineral flats. Especially the big mineral flats that we have. These are typically it can be the big lake beds. So if there is that prolonged saturation, basically the continuously saturated environment, especially in old lake beds from those glacial lakes that I showed you on that other slide, that's when you will see the organic accumulation and then the formation of organic flats. These obviously have a lot of importance right now, right? Think about the carbon storage. Think about there's a lot of attention being played on Minnesota's peatland areas. And the water regimes, again, can be pretty complicated. For those of you who have ever been up like the Sax-Zim bog, you can basically see any water regime possible, right? But most of the time it's just continuously saturated, especially along the fringes of it, or when I'll show you this slide again, but when you're literally walking up the dome of the peat where it's accumulating, you kind of get into this area where sometimes it doesn't even feel saturated. It is, but depends on where you are on that dome is going to really be largely reflective of which actual indicators, hydrology indicators you're actually going to observe. I typically will see a high water table with it. And that is basically the most common one that we'll find in organic flat, right? You can find the others, of course. Dry season water table is pretty dependable if you're in that dry water season organic flat. But largely, high water table is the ticket for most of these. On the soil side, of course, that's where, depending on your perspective, it can either be really boring or really easy or really awesome and interesting. I tend to follow in the latter camp where I think that although I might be just simply looking at a histosol all day, I think some of those profiles are the most interesting ones you could find. This is a profile coming out of a site that we're looking at right now for a mitigation bank up in the peatland bog areas in northeast Minnesota. And at first glance, you look at this thing and like, man, this is dark organics. Great, histosol, check, walk away, right? But then you start looking at it a little bit closer, and I don't know if you can see in the back of the whole my laser works. Look at that. It's actually just a little bit of a sand lens in there. That sand lens is depleted too. So at some point there was an event that brought this sand from somewhere else, a high energy event that was able to carry that sand, deposit it there, and then you had how many decades worth of organic accumulation that occurred since then, right over that. So if you really start digging into these histosols, especially in the well-formed organic we have in the peatlands in northeast Minnesota, you can really start to see some complex evidence of some serious stuff that happened, like catastrophic events. So don't just check histosol and walk away. Look at it a little bit closer because they can be pretty interesting and give you kind of a look back in time. But this, again, is pretty typical. This is the hydrology that we receive for the vast majority of these areas. So as you look at it, again, the indicators, in my experience, generally just follow where you are on that peatland area. If you're in the middle of the dome, you're going to be seeing the thickest organic accumulations. Yeah, depending on where you are, you'll see that histosol throughout. But eventually you'll get to where it's thin enough that you just get histoped on. And if you're way out on the fringe, but still kind of right on the periphery of that peatland area, chances are you're still classified as organic flat, but you just might be sitting there looking at a loamy mucky mineral. So lacustrine fringe wetlands, again, can be very interesting in the sense that they're a little bit more dynamic, right? They're those bidirectional hydraulics. So you not only have the overland flow from the catchment basin, but the lake itself kind of keeping the stable levels. But look at how much they can flex. Look at how much they can change. This is just 2 seasons. End of 2021, you can see we're getting droughty, the water levels are changing, the blue dotted line is still the surface, right? Oh, I'm sorry, that's 0, right? So this is depth to water. But then all of a sudden, boom, they bounce. So in this case, that wetland at that fringe of that lake got a whole lot more water than it had the previous year. And that can be reflected then in the type of hydrology indicators that you might observe. So 1 year at that same spot in the lacustrine fringe, you might not have surface water at the end of 2021, or you might have just very, very little bit, depending on when you're there. But no matter when you were there in 2022, you're picking up A1. So that could be variable, right? When you're looking at the soil indicators, again, depending on where you are in that fringe, you could be seeing anything from that super thick histosol backing away, a little bit thinner histocapopedon. But the common thread here is that it's organics typically, and it's a relatively thick package of organics, or at least dark material with a fair amount of organics in it before you hit anything else. So as you're looking at a lacustrine fringe, you got your histosol right smack dab in the middle, maybe even over that sphagnum, going out pretty close to the water there. But then as you work your way back, where again, a lot of our delineations are happening, you might just pick up that thick, dark surface, right? That A12. All right, the last one I want to show you here is the riverine, right? You guys keeping count? Riverine. So note the hydrology regime. Temporary flooded, right? You guys remember the difference between temporary flooded and seasonally flooded? Which one is more wet? Which one? Seasonally, right? So what I think of with temporary flooded, I think about that very top of or the very edge of the floodplain where the water once got to, right? That's where we mark where our temporary flooded would be. The other water regimes are closer to the river, right? So with that though, we can see some, because of course that flooding event, kind of unlikely that you're actually there for that flooding event, right? As a delineator, well, sometimes you might be. I happen to be there at that Snake River site when I saw flooded, but most of the time you're doing delineation, you're not, right? So what you see is you see those B, C, and D indicators, right? You're not actually observing the slam dunk A indicators. You're seeing those watermarks, those sediment deposits, those drift deposits, right? The sparsely vegetated concave surface, one of our favorites. We see those sometimes in our classes. We bring people out to show them. And the other thing that is unique about riverine wetlands that I like in terms of the hydric soil indicators is that we see often these stratified layers. When you pull a profile of a stratified layer, sometimes your vision just blurs, rightfully so, because you're looking at something like that, right? So if you know you're in a riverine setting and you pull something like that, don't just walk away because you're confused. Pull out the guidebook, pull out the manual, pull out your flip book, and really walk through it, because oftentimes it's A5, check. We probably have all those other B and C, D indicators on the hydrology side. We can call it a wetland, right? But I think we can all appreciate the difficulty that floodplains can present us sometimes in wetland delineations. I see a lot of heads nodding right now. Okay, so when we're looking at it, I'm going to start in the middle here, because depleted or glade matrix is really common if you're actually like digging into a bed of a stream, right? Or a lake too. We see glade matrix a lot, right? Because it's permanently saturated. When we're walking out, we see the stratified layers is typically going to be in those areas where there is an active bounce to the floodplain, okay? And that's why you're seeing the stratification, different events. right? Different events bring different sediment sizes, bring different colors into the equation. That's why you have the complexity of stratified layers. But then when you get out to the edge, again, we're oftentimes doing our delineations, you're gonna start to see the evidence pop up on the redox dark surface. Now, one caution, one thing that I've learned, I grew up down in Rochester along the Zumbro River Valley area, and I saw, when I first came back for home after school, I was learning all this cool hydrology and hydrosoil stuff. I was digging in, I was finding redox dark surface, and I was way up on that hillside, coming down into the wetland. I was like, what the heck is going on? I was seeing the edge of that temporary flooded area. I wasn't seeing the other indicators. I was just seeing that extreme bounce that happened to be long enough just to pick up a little bit of redox. So a lot of times in rivers and river systems, riverine systems, this is too high. The other parameters aren't lining up. So we have to go down just a little bit more. All right. I know that was a lot I threw at you. I just want a couple takeaways here. I think a lot of you guys have seen this on the right here, the made up word that Ben and I have got, we call hydroscapes, right? Where we got our 3 wetland parameters, but then we always need to be taking into context these factors, the climate, the ecology, and especially when we're talking about this conversation with HGM, the geomorphology. Okay? So our HGM classes are built on those 3 parameters, the geomorphology, the hydrology, and the hydraulics. Those hydrology indicators give us that evidence of water regimes. How long has that been muted?
Just a little bit. As 1 minute. Any questions? I think the audio just cut out.
How often do you see oxidized rhizospheres?
Well, fairly common, I'd say. I don't know about fairly common. Where I would expect to see them is kind of in a spot where there's enough bounce going on that you're going aqueous to non-aqueous, aqueous to non-aqueous. So you've got it where you bounce up, it's anaerobic, but then it drops out. There's still oxygen there. The plants are still doing their business, right? So that's where you'd expect to see pretty diverse variety. Actually, I don't know how many times I actually had it on the chart. Did you pay attention? How many?
It was only under 1.
Was it really just under 1? Okay. So you do see it, but it's again, it's going to be something where you're going to see variable water regimes.
Can it ever be historic, like in an ag field or anything like that, or would you just call that pore linings?
I would call that pore linings in that situation. Agree? Others agree? That's what I would call it.
Okay.
Yep. Good question. Anything else? Any questions from online?
On that, yeah.
All right. You want that? Good.
All right, I'm just gonna breeze through, and I'll. Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
everybody except for him, right?
Yes. No, well, just cruise high level, take a high level tour through these plant community classes, but then we want to end with like kind of a cross sectionality of these systems. I got some diagrams for you folks to consider, and hopefully we can kind come through and get some discussion going on how these pieces kind of start fitting together. So again, to reintroduce Agers Reed Plant Communities, it's been around for a while, first published in 1988. Had a number of editions. The current 2014 edition includes 18 different classes and subtypes. I've applied some different modifications when I do my work, so I tend to use my own modifications. So I just want to put that full disclosure out on front. In the original, so one is in the original Agers and Reed, there was no kind of rich fen concept at all. And so I talked Agers into at least coming up with this sedge mat idea. He called it sedge mat. And then in the most recent one, he actually went away from it a little bit. But I really apply like this rich fen concept. If you're followers of the DNR native plant communities, that's a huge concept in that system. So I think it needs to be applied here as well. There's another class called seasonally flooded basins. There's obviously other seasonally flooded habitats, and this is one of those confusing things because usually these seasonally flooded basins would have an A water regime where that's temporarily flooded if you're looking at water regimes. But basically it's something that is open water and then the water goes away, you have a mud flat and annual species and that kind of thing. This can be more broadly applied other than to just basins. And then finally, there are a lot of, in the former Agers and Reed, there's a lot of variation around sedge meadow, fresh meadow. I just tend to call everything fresh. So that disclaimer up front. A few words about DNR native plant communities. Hopefully you guys are at least generally familiar of this, but this is the system, the very detailed system developed by the Minnesota Biological Survey. And again, there's a different purpose here. The purpose, and that's the driver of why there's so many classes, right? So the purpose for Biological Survey and Heritage Program is to identify unique and rare native habitats. It was a very data-driven exercise. There's a wealth of expertise went into it. And according to my count, there are 74 NPCs that would qualify as a wetland community. So that is a lot of classes. Remember when I was talking earlier about classification being a Goldilocks problem? In my application for doing veg work, I tend to simplify and defer to the Agers and Reed. But of course, if you're doing some project that is really looking at unique habitats, by all means, yes, this is a great resource. And if you are curious, I have developed a MPC to Agers and Reed crosswalk in the FQA development paper, and that can be found on the interwebs. All right, so let's just breeze through these classes. And we'll start with open water class to deep water class. So shallow open water, this is basically your open water aquatic community, right? So you have true aquatic plants, and there's submergent, floating leaves, aquatics. You'll see a little percentage next to each of these names. That percentage is from the Minnesota Wetland Condition Assessment. So that is our estimate of the total wetland population of the state in that plant community. That's the little asterisk is there. You'll notice that this is actually a pretty low number for shallow open water. The reason is that we don't sample anything more than a meter deep. There is obviously more open water wetland out there, and it depends on what you include, but it's probably more like 10, 15%, something like that. So just keep that in mind. The other community estimates I feel pretty confident about. So seasonally flooded, these are, again, inundated open water areas to begin with, and then you get a drawdown mudflat annuals, right? Deep marsh. This is where we have emergent vegetation, typically greater than 6 inches for extended periods of time, like all through the year, throughout most years, typically, and it's emergence combined with rooted aquatics. That's kind of the key differentiation with the shallow marshes. You have the rooted aquatics and the deep marsh. And the picture in the lower right-hand corner on the right side, that's all wild rice there. So that's wild rice, and then the left-hand part is like a shrubby shore fen. So within the wild rice, yeah, it's a couple feet of water, and you have aquatics intermingled within that. That's your deep marsh. Shallow marsh. Emergent vegetation, again, typically you have inundation for an extended period of time, but often that inundation will go away and will just be at a saturated soil condition near the end of the growing season. And the difference between this and deep marsh is that you don't have that rooted aquatic kind of component to it. So our typical veg is cattails, lake sedge, things like that, but you just don't have necessarily the aquatics to go with it. Rich fen, again, an emergent class, typically raminoid dominated, though sometimes it can be shrubby. But these are on peat forming wetlands. But the peat lacks that sphagnum moss that is exuding the acid. So these are kind of circumneutral or slightly acidic kind of peat forming wetlands that lack kind of that acidic component. Calcareous fen, again, a peatland, but these are where you have a continuous discharge of groundwater, and that groundwater is enriched, right? And what you see then is development of a calcareous peat, and you have very specific calciphile plants like sterile sedge, prairie sedge. There's a whole indicator suite around that. This is like our rarest plant community type, right? And it's really focused on those groundwater discharge areas. Fresh meadow, again, an emergent class. So you'll see a theme here. There's a lot of different emergent plant communities, right? Again, graminoid dominant, so grasses and sedges, but usually these are in drier habitats. They're either going to be a continuously saturated water regime or a temporarily flooded water regime. And your dominants are typically going to be things like blue joint grasses, tussock sedges, reed canary grass, and abundant forbs like goldenrod. Wet prairie, very similar to fresh meadows, but typically a little bit drier, and we have prairie graminoids instead of your blue joints, things like that. Let's move into our shrub classes now. So we have two of our tall shrub classes. Our first one is alder thicket, and that's just a wetland with a bunch of alder in it. And the other one is called shrub car, and that's basically where it's more willows and dogwoods and things like that, and even maybe in some parts of eastern Minnesota, the glossy buckthorn, or the glossy buckthorn, sorry. And then let's look at open bog. So typically, when you're looking at coordinate classes, open bog comes as a scrub shrub. You might not think of it, but you know, all the shrubs are this tall. They're all the ericaceous shrubs, like your leatherleaf, Labrador tea, things like that. The differentiation there, though, is that you have typically that continuous blanket of sphagnum mosses that is exuding acid. You have a very low pH, and you have plants that are specifically adapted to that habitat. Finally, let's finish up with the forested classes. Coniferous bogs, extremely similar to the open bogs. The only difference is in the tree cover, right? Coniferous bogs, you have more of a canopy of tamarack or black spruce, whereas the open bogs, it's more stunted and open. But again, the same thing, acid species. Coniferous swamps, so this is our most common widespread of these plant communities in the state. About 23% of our wetlands are coniferous swamps. And again, we have coniferous trees, tamarack, black spruce, but maybe even white cedar now. The difference between these and true bogs is that you have a more enriched understory. You don't have all those true acid species growing in the understory. Hardwood swamps, those are broadleaf deciduous trees on typically saturated soils. That's like your black ash swamps. In this classification, it can also include like wet aspen forests. You see a lot of that in the northwestern part of the state. I think those might deserve kind of their own class here. We can talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, floodplain forests. Again, just like David was talking, we have bidirectional flooding from the river. We have species that are completely adapted to that. That's our silver maples, our cottonwoods, those kinds of guys. So we quick breeze through that. Now I'm gonna lay out a couple of complex diagrams for you guys. and see if we can walk through a couple of things here. So on the top axis, or I guess the horizontal axis, we have columns to differentiate our HGM classes, riverine, lacustrine, fringe, depressional, our flats, our slopes. On the vertical axis, we have our water regimes that we spoke about. And they are sorted from kind of dry to wet. So you see that it goes A, D, C, F, G, H. So that, again, it's supposed to go from dry to wet. And then within the matrix, where at least I think that I see these different plant community types, where they cross over here. So first of all, can anybody tell me why in kind of the lower right-hand area, it's just all blank space? We don't see these kind of wetter plant communities within flats and slopes. Anybody have any thoughts about that? So why would we have semi-permanent to permanent water in a wetland? What would it take to have that?
Geomorphic position.
Geomorphic position, or like say in the case of a depression, you actually have a topographic contour that's holding back water, right? In a riverine or lacustrine system, you have an adjacent aquatic ecosystem that is transitioning up there. So you have open water. While in slopes and flats, right, they don't have those, they're not associated with those things. That's the definition of those. So like a riverine or lacustrine fringe system, they're defined by that bidirectional water dynamics with that adjacent water body, or a depression system that's defined by that topographic contour. So fresh meadows, let's just kind of walk through this. They can obviously occur in temporarily flooded situations as well as continuously saturated conditions in a wide variety of HGM types, right? Maybe you'll note, like for our slope groundwater and organic flats, there's a blank space for temporarily flooded. Why would you think that might be the case? Because our groundwater fed slopes are defined by that continuous discharge of groundwater, and they typically are accumulating organic matter. The only way you can get organic matter at the surface, that histic epipedon or histosol, is by having continuously saturated conditions. So typically, these organic flats, which are defined by organic accumulation, right? They're going to have a dewater regime. They're not going to have any, right? Okay, so let's walk through this. Shallow marshes, you're typically going to find them in your seasonally flooded water regime, as well as your semi-permanent in these three HGM types. But then there's going to be a broad transition of deep marsh here between in the semi-permanently flooded into the more permanent classes. Look at some other emergent plant communities, rich fens. Again, the vast majority of rich fens are going to have a continuously saturated water regime, and they're going to be organic flats for the most part. Obviously, they can be depressions, but a lot of times when they show up in depressions or at fringing environments, they are as floating mats. You get that, I see that quite often, actually. So these rich fens can occur as floating mats. Wet prairies are typically, you're only going to find those in a temporarily flooded water regime. That's going to be in a drier kind of environment, right? Once you get to continuously saturated conditions, usually those wet prairies will transition into a fresh meadow. And that, of course, can occur over a variety of HGM settings. Seasonally flooded. When they're in their own basin, they will often have an A temporarily flooded water regime. So in the spring, they start out as open water. By the fall, they're full of like smartweeds and beggar's ticks, things like that. But they can also happen in the edges of intermittently exposed in basins or like on the edge of lakes and things like that, when you get a water drawdown, mud flat, annuals pop up. So that can be in wide ranging water regime. Open bogs are always going to be in continuously saturated conditions. And then finally, calc fens, you're only going to find that in a slope groundwater area, in a slope groundwater HGM class, because you have that continuous discharge of groundwater, right? So now look at the complexity of this thing. Where do you guys see the most overlap of just these emergent classes? And these are just the emergent classes. In terms like, okay, what has the most overlap in terms of water regime? Did you say the D water regime? The D water regime has a lot of overlap in it. So that's where we get a lot of these differences. And that's, I think, what can make a lot of this kind of classification stuff a little bit difficult. Let's talk about our scrub shrub communities. So again, we see a shrub carn, alder thicket. I just kind of pulled them together. Again, you're going to find these typically on temporarily flooded or continuously saturated water regimes typically. What else do we have? Occasionally you can have rich fens, maybe that are dominated by like a sweet gale or a bog birch or something like that. So they might show up as a kind of a shrub community. But again, they can also be floating mats in those wetter conditions. And bogs are going to be in your saturated conditions here again. So no, right? We have a lot of blank space in these wetter water regimes. It's because these woody species can't tolerate that prolonged inundation, right? And finally, forested kinds of communities. We have our floodplain forest is only going to be associated with riverine and lacustrine fringe and typically temporarily flooded. You know, when I look at NWI maps, I see a lot of floodplain forest that is mapped as PFOC, which would say the seasonal water regime. But in a lot of those cases, if you read the definition of what the temporary water regime is, they're actually A's. So and you guys walked along in Fort Snelling or Snelling State Park, go down to Pike Island. All of Pike Island, it's all floodplain forest, right? And you can typically walk down there because it's only flooded for brief periods of time. But other than that, it's pretty dry, right? So your soil saturation is going to be below the surface. Most of that is mapped as a sea water regime, and I think that's like maybe a misapplication of that. So that's a point of knowing the definition of your water regime versus what you might see on an NWI. Anyway, hardwood swamps are typically going to be continuously saturated. I have seen surface water slope hardwood swamps, particularly farther up north, along the North Shore, particular and near the boundary waters. And then you can get these. I'm not sure what to do with these yet. I think we need a little revision. But you get these wet aspen forests, particularly northwestern Minnesota, that they're really temporarily flooded. They don't have that soil saturation. You'll have mineral soils underneath, aspen. And just like David said, it's the line between upland and wetland up there is razor thin, and you scratch your head a lot, like, are we even in a wetland? But that's where those things occur. Your coniferous swamps and open bogs are going to be in your continuously saturated water regimes typically. And maybe if you have like a floating condition, or really on the edge of kind of what would you call the tension zone, where you get coniferous swamps that drop out like Pope County, you get some mix of cattails and tamarack trees. Anyway, brief blast of intersectionality of that. We're going to try to end with a quick exercise and hopefully get some interaction.
Absolutely. True
Yeah.
form, got to end with a pop quiz, right? So now it's on you. Sorry, people online, but folks in the room, what's the HGM classification here? Riverine, why are you saying that? Well, I can see the river, but also too, imagine you couldn't see that river. Are there other clues there? Just looking at the LiDAR. You can see meander scars, right? You can see a very well-defined belt width of that meander plane or meander belt. So you can see a lot of other clues there. What water regimes would this be mapped? Think about what Mike just said. Temporary flooded, right? So the idea is that, again, you're gonna see your furthest extent, you might see water or hydrology indicators all the way out. Doesn't mean you always have that surface saturation, right? But you temporarily will see that flooding, you'll see the indicators that way. What about hydrology indicators? What kind of hydrology indicators might you expect here?
B, C, and D indicator?
B, C, and D indicators, say more. Why not A?
Because you're generally not gonna have, any kind of permanent inundation in these kind of areas, or saturation. It kind of ties back to the temporarily flooded component, so.
The vast majority of that growing season, when they're out there doing delineation, you're not actually gonna see that flooding happen. You're gonna be looking for those other clues, right? Those other groups of indicators. That's right. Any particular indicators that are unique to this that you might be able to find? Like I was talking about? Drift deposits, stratified layers, like it, yep. Good. What about soil indicators? What might you find for soil indicators with this? Are you gonna see histosols? No. Are you gonna see more of those saturated or some of those fringy type of indicators like redox dark surface? That sort of thing? Maybe an A11, especially if you start getting into it a little bit. But primarily you're looking for those indicators that aren't gonna be a lot of organic accumulation. You're primarily looking for the thinner, more upper part of the profile to find your indicators there. What about plant communities? What plant community would be in? In this case, I tried to mix the transparency up because there's a couple here. I know it's probably hard for you to see, especially in the back. On that top part of the floodplain, what do you see up there? Just give you a hint, there's trees up there. Floodplain forest, right? What could another temporary flooded acres and reed be?
Shrubcar, you could have wet meadow.
There's both of those on this site, in fact, yep. Good. All right. Not gonna give you that. All right, so what HGM class? Depression, right? Look at that. I mean, that's pretty pronounced. This is over in Spicer, so Prairie Pothole area. Okay. What about hydrology indicators? Well, you can see some of them, right? I'll just flip that on. What do you see right away? You will see it, right? You see the inundation. How about soil indicators? Think about the wetland boundary. Yeah, obviously you're not out there in a canoe, right? You might be, but what are you gonna see around those fringes? You're gonna see organic accumulation? No? Not even on the fringe? Within the basin? You'll see organic accumulation right along the fringe there. But walking your way out, you're gonna see more of those A11s, A12s walking out, A11s especially there. Good. How about plant communities? Plant community, first one, obvious one. It's an emergent, right? Which plant community though?
Is it?
Shallow marsh? Into deep marsh, maybe? Mike, what's your comment on that?
I would say it's all shallow open water, and the green signature that you see there are lily pads or water shield or something.
Eutrophication.
Or it could be, well, usually that's just like an olive green.
You say eutrophication.
Yeah, yeah.
Anytime.
Good. All right. Good thing we got all our 2 hours there, Keller. Thank you.
My points.
You'll get them.
Credits earned today.
Last questions. Keep a screen on so it's not a blank screen.
Oh.
Bet. Oh,
Go back a couple slides. One of the tables that Michael had.
Go on the table.
Like,
Sure, sure, yeah.
What happened to B?
What happened to B?
What happened to B? Oh, okay, so for older practitioners of NWI, there's you see a lot of PMB, and basically the B got replaced. Slide as continuously saturated. I'm not sure it ever was, but now the new B is called like seasonally saturated, and it's meant to be for cases like in northwestern Minnesota where you do get some hydric soil indicators, but you rarely have any surface saturate or surface inundation. But you'll get some saturation just below surface on mineral soils. That's where I see it, and those all get mapped as an A.
The other spot that I would see that condition is in the clay pans.
Yeah.
With red pear material. Well, you'll get some redox there, it'd be hard to pick, but you're not always gonna be directly associated with a saturation or a water table all the time.
And there's like a K, if you go into that, well, everybody, it was very early on, but it was like that cheat sheet of all the coordinate codes. One, you can find that on the interwebs. Just print that out and like stick it on the wall next to your workstation. First of all, and then you'll see there's a bunch of other water regimes listed there that you'll never see on the NWI map. And you can look up the definitions in the mapping standard. And they're there, they exist, but they're rarely used.
Do we have anything there?
Wayne also asks what happened to B waters.
Oh, were we on mute the whole time?
No, it mutes every time I feel like I come up to the laptop, so.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming.
Give a round of applause to our presenters here. Thanks for coming and being patient with the audio, so we appreciate you coming out.
Yeah. I mean,